Enfield's story never really worked until 1.2, where the first time everything actually comes together and you can finally see what this story is trying to be. For me, Arknights Enfield has been a strange experience so far, almost a polarizing one. On one side, I've genuinely enjoyed my time on the game, but on the other, there's always been this lingering sense of disappointment, and most of it comes from the narrative. Given how much praise the original Arknight story receives, expectations for Enfield were naturally high, but up until now, nothing really stood out. It wasn't bad, but it never quite came together in a way that actually left an impact. And looking at it as a whole, the story always felt like it was moving, just not building towards anything meaningful. That's where 1.2 changes everything. After going to this update, for the first time the direction becomes clear, not just where the story is going, but what it can become, and more importantly, why it wasn't working before. So let's talk about it. One of Enfield's biggest issues up until now was how heavily it leaned into world building, so much so that everything else started to feel scattered. The conflict, the themes, even the story beats themselves never really came together in a way that allowed them to hit properly. They existed, but they didn't reinforce each other. As a result, the story often felt like it was moving, but without building towards something cohesive. That's where 1.2 stands out immediately. Across the board, whether we're talking about character interactions, the central conflict, or the themes, they don't just exist alongside each other anymore, they connect. More than that, they support each other in a way Enfield hasn't managed before. The improvement is especially noticeable in the character interactions. They feel more natural, more grounded, and more integrated into what's happening around them. The introduction of Arcane plays a big role here. Particularly through her dynamic with Shen, their interactions don't feel like interruptions or side moments, they're part of the flow of the story, and importantly, the game gives them just enough space to matter without pulling attention away from the main conflict. With all that said, despite the overall positive reception 1.2 has received, there are still a few criticisms that keep coming up. Pacing is one of them, along with the idea that the story is too dialogue heavy. That's something I don't really agree with. There are moments where things drag, but not because of the writing itself. The issue comes from the gameplay, specifically those segments where you're moving back and forth too often, repeating the same kind of actions. That's where the pacing starts to feel stretched. The narrative, on the other hand, flows much better than before. Another point I've seen is that the stakes are introduced but don't fully land, either emotionally or narratively. And honestly, I don't really see where that comes from. 1.2 builds directly on the conflict that's been present since the beginning of the game. The situation in Wuling isn't minor. If we fail here, the city is gone. The people in it are gone. The stakes are very clearly defined and they're high from the start. What makes it work even more is how the story presents that conflict. The attack on the city is easily one of the strongest parts of the update. The way it brings everyone together, from major characters to NPCs, creates a sense of scale that wasn't really there before. It feels coordinated, it feels urgent, and more importantly, it feels real. Everyone is involved, and because of that, the emotional impact lands. You see people fighting to protect their home, their lives, and not all of them make it. Some are injured, some are lost, and the story doesn't shy away from showing that. So when it comes to the stakes, both narratively and emotionally, they're very much present. There's also been some discussion around the nature of the update itself. Some people see it more as a transition point rather than a culmination. However, it's actually both. It acts as a culmination because it brings the ongoing conflict to a peak, especially through the confrontation with Neferis. At the same time, it clearly sets the stage for what comes next, and that's not a weakness, it's exactly what the story needed. For a while, Enfield's narrative felt like it was moving forward without really evolving. Here, for the first time, it feels like the progression actually leads somewhere. That said, not everything works perfectly. There is one aspect that feels a bit off, and that's how Zhuang Fangyi's character story is handled within the main story. Their integration doesn't land as cleanly as it should, but I'll get to that in a bit. Before that, I want to focus on something more important. While 1.2 improves a lot of things, there are two areas where Enfield has always struggled the most, and this is where the update makes its biggest impact. If you've been following the channel for a while, you probably already know which parts of Enfield's story I've been the most critical of. The conflict, the antagonists, and the protagonist. Those have consistently been the weakest points for me, and 1.2 makes noticeable progress on most of them. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Let's start with the conflict and the antagonists, since these two are closely tied together. One of the biggest issues with Enfield's story up until now was how static the conflict felt. The antagonists kept moving forward with their plan, things kept progressing in their favor, and despite our involvement, nothing really changed. We were there, we were present, but we weren't actually shifting the outcome. That kind of structure gets repetitive quickly. If the situation doesn't evolve, the tension doesn't either. 1.2 finally breaks that pattern. That's the part that surprised me the most. Finally, the conflict actually moves, it changes direction. Arcane's involvement plays a big role in that, especially in how she disrupts Ardasir's plan, something I didn't expect to happen this early, or this decisively. At the same time, the confrontation with Nefaris doesn't just stall things, it ends it. That's a major shift. Up until now, I was expecting the story to continue in the same way, with the antagonist staying one step ahead and the protagonist constantly reacting without ever fully catching up. Instead, 1.2 allows that conflict to evolve, and that alone changes how the entire narrative feels. It's also the moment where I started looking at Enfield differently. For the first time, I can actually see the potential it has. Now, even with that improvement, I think this is also where a lot of the criticism around 1.2 comes from. While the conflict itself progresses, the antagonists don't quite keep up with it. And to be honest, they're still one of the weaker parts of the story. There's just not much to them right now. Most of what defines them is still hidden behind mystery. Who they are, what they really want, how they think, and while that kind of slow reveal can work, it also creates a problem in the present. If we don't understand them, it's harder to care about them. So even though the confrontation with Nefaris marks a clear turning point in the conflict, it might not land as strongly for everyone, simply because she hasn't been developed enough for that moment to carry real weight. The same applies to Ardasir. There are hints that there's more to him, and I'm sure that will matter later, but right now most of what makes him interesting gets still tied to things we haven't seen yet. In the current state of the story, there isn't much there to connect with. And that gap between a progressing conflict and underdeveloped antagonists is likely where some of the disconnect comes from. On the protagonist side, things are a bit different. I've never been a big fan of the typical self-insert gacha protagonist, and Enfield started very much in that direction. There have been small improvements along the way, but nothing that really pushed them into feeling like a fully defined character. 1.2 changes that, at least partially. The protagonist is far more active here, both in combat and in their role as the administrator. That second aspect is especially important, because it's supposed to be a core part of who they are, someone deeply tied to technology, someone capable of developing and understanding it at a high level. Before, that side of them barely showed up in the story. Now we actually start to see it. Not constantly, and not in its full potential, but enough to feel like a step forward. It gives them a clear presence and more defined role in the narrative, and makes their involvement feel justified beyond just being the player character. At this point, the protagonist is close to feeling fully realized. There's just one thing holding them back: the voice. They're stuck in that awkward middle ground, partially voiced but not consistently. Some lines are delivered, others are left silent, and it creates this uneven experience where the character never fully settles into a clear identity. It's hard to understand the reasoning behind it. Fully voicing the protagonist would solve most of that instantly, and it's not something players tend to push back against. As it stands, this half measure ends up doing more harm than good. It keeps the character from fully coming together, even when everything else starts to align. So overall, 1.2 makes real progress in two of these areas. The conflict evolves in a way it never did before, and the protagonist finally starts to feel like an active part of the story. The antagonist, not so much. And that imbalance likely explains why some people feel like the update doesn't hit as hard as it could. Even so, what 1.2 does for the conflict alone and the direction it gives to the protagonist is enough to make it stand out. It's not perfect, but it's meaningful progress. That said, there's one part of this update that doesn't quite land the way it should, not because it's bad, but because it feels out of place. And that comes down to how Zhuang Fang's character story is handled within the main narrative. This is where the update starts to feel a little strange. Even though everything we've talked about so far works quite well, this is the part that makes the whole experience slightly uneven. Not bad, just awkward. What 1.2 ends up doing is presenting what feels like two separate stories placed back to back. On one side you have the main conflict, the culmination we just talked about, with all its stakes, tension and resolution. On the other, you get what is essentially a character-focused continuation centered around Zhuang Fangyi. To be clear, taken on its own, that character story is not weak, it's actually quite solid. It leans a little bit too much into melodrama at times, at least for my taste, but overall it's handled well. The direction it takes might not fully land for everyone, I wasn't entirely sold on it myself, but the execution is still there. More importantly, it does something very valuable for the protagonist. That entire segment highlights just how far the protagonist has come. Compared to the more typical gacha self-insert approach, this feels like a genuinely defined character stepping in, understanding the situation and actively resolving it. That progression is one of the strongest aspects of the update. So the issue isn't the content of the story, it's where and how it's placed. Coming right after the culmination of the main conflict, this shift creates a noticeable disconnect. Normally, adding a character-focused segment after a major event wouldn't be a problem. A short epilogue, a moment to explore the aftermath, that kind of structure works well, but here it goes further than that. The tone changes, the themes shift, the overall rhythm of the story resets. It starts to feel less like a continuation and more like a separate piece attached to the end of something else. Even though it technically builds on the consequences of the main conflict, the transition between the two doesn't feel natural. The intensity of the first half sets a very specific atmosphere, and instead of gradually moving out of it, the story pivots too sharply. That's where the awkwardness comes from. At the same time, I do think this is an important step. What they're trying to do here, integrating character stories directly into the main narrative, is something I actually want to see more of. I know a lot of people prefer keeping character stories separate, treating them as side content, but I've never really been a fan of that approach. When you isolate character arcs from the main story, both sides lose something. The main narrative loses depth, because those character developments are happening outside of it, and the characters themselves start to feel disconnected from the events that are supposed to define them. Bringing those character arcs into the main story is the right direction, it just needs to be done more carefully. Right now the execution isn't quite there. Instead of feeling like a single continuous narrative, 1.2 ends up feeling like two distinct parts placed one after the other. The connection exists on a structural level, but it doesn't fully translate in terms of tone or flow. With a smoother transition, something that bridges the emotional and thematic gap between these sections, it could have worked much better. So while this part of the update doesn't land as cleanly as it should, I still see it as a positive sign, simply because it shows what they're aiming for. If they can refine this approach, if they can make these integrations feel seamless instead of segmented, then this could become one of Enfield's strongest storytelling tools moving forward. At the end of the day, 1.2 ends up being more than just a good update. It's a turning point. The story is finally taking shape. There's direction now, there's structure, and more importantly, there's a sense of identity starting to form. And I think that matters more than people give it credit for. A lot of the expectations around Endfield come from the original Arknights, and that's understandable, but this story doesn't need to follow the same path. It shouldn't. It needs to become its own thing, and 1.2 feels like the first real step in that direction. That alone is enough. And speaking of stories that are starting to shift direction, Wuthering Waves is doing something very similar right now, but in a completely different way. With the 3.3 livestream, the story isn't just moving forward, it's starting to raise the stakes in a way that could change everything, especially with how characters like Yuki are being positioned. If Enfield is finally starting to take shape, Wuthering Waves might be heading towards the moment where that shape breaks. So if you want to see where that's going, I broke it all down in my latest video right here.